In the mid-30s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was one of the few in the United States who clearly understood that the policy of isolation, non-interference in overseas situations was hopelessly obsolete. In the meantime, the vacation after World War I was coming to an end. It smelled like gunpowder in the world. But America still considered the world overseas to be safely distant and indisputably vicious, sincerely believing that the only way to protect themselves from the war was not to interfere in the old world's business. In 1935, the fascist Italy led by Benito Mussolini invaded Ethiopia.
Your luck is good on Friday, and on Monday it's the cards.
In 1936, General Franco unleashed a civil war against the communist government. Germany and Italy took a side with Franco, and the Soviet Union stood up for the communists. The conflict in Europe was escalating. In 1937, Japan assaulted China. But the central events of the 1930s were revolving around the Nazi Germany that became the focus of threat to the world after Adolf Hitler came to power. Having no desire to be involved in the world's conflicts of the 30s, Americans, in their own way, were preparing for the worst by passing new laws. The Congress passed new bills on American neutrality, one after another. Roosevelt did not want those bills, but he could not do anything about them at that time.
There was so much pressure from the isolation.
His hands were tied. The public opinion was for neutrality. But Roosevelt himself concluded in 1937 that a new world war was coming. This war also constituted a danger for the United States, and he was thinking of how to prepare for it.
But Roosevelt understood that America just started coming out of the deep economic breakdown and wanted to think only about pleasant things. The war was not on the list. According to the polling held in 1937, 95% of Americans did not believe that Germany, Japan, or Italy were of any threat to the United States. They didn't even want to listen about preparing for this inevitable war, as Roosevelt believed. Roosevelt was thinking about his actions. Later, he uttered a phrase that would eloquently describe all his further actions.
I'm an illusionist. I don't want anybody to know what my right hand or my left hand is doing. At times, I have to be obscure and tell half-truths.
He was a very cagey politician.
He was a very smart politician. I believe that the epigram by a French diplomat defines him in the best way. God gave the man ability to speak so that he could hide his real feelings and thoughts. Roosevelt never lost sight of his real goals, but he would sometimes move toward them, not along a straight line, but in zigzags that only he alone could understand.
In 1939, America launched a gradual, first even inconspicuous, rearmament program that gave another impetus to the development of economy. For the next several years, the unemployment rate continued to drop, since many people found jobs at military plants. Others joined the Army that, at that point, was in a deplorable state. The whole U.S. Army had 5 divisions. 136,000 men, and was rated 19th in the world in numerical strength. Bulgaria and Romania were way behind. Equipment was not the best either. The rifles were of World War I models. They were practicing using dummies, since in 1939 the American Army only had 500 machine guns, about 200 cannons, and 20 obsolete tanks. On September 1st, 1939, fascist Germany poured all its power on Poland. England and France immediately stood up for it and declared war on Germany. 2 days later, Roosevelt addressed the nation on radio.
This nation will remain
a neutral nation. I hope the United States will keep out of this war.
I
believe that it will, and I will give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
When Roosevelt was giving guarantees about neutrality, he already knew that the involvement of the United States in the war was inevitable. So why did he not say this openly to America?
Of course, Roosevelt was an outstanding politician, understood that the United States would not be able to remain neutral from these events, but it was not obvious for the people at large and other politicians.
Even before his presidency, Roosevelt wrote in one of his articles, "There were periods in our history when American government could influence the ideas and actions of the civilized world. Now he was convinced that the new World War was not only a fight for the world's supremacy, but also a battle for the future of human civilization. And it was time for America to participate in this battle, in order not to fall under the boot of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan." Roosevelt believed that the leading role among the future victors should belong to his country. He saw the United States as a superpower that had no competitors, weakened by years in the war. The whole planet would become one big family where peace and love would reign. And the United States would be the head of this family, the father who would teach, reconcile, and even punish everyone. So we have to join the war. It was absolutely clear to Roosevelt. But how was he supposed to explain this to his people? Besides, in order to implement such grand plans, he had to do something which would be no less difficult: to become the first president in the U.S. history elected for the 3rd term. And the war continued to gain momentum. In April 1940, Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. In May and June, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and France capitulated to Wehrmacht. At the time when England held its breath, Winston Churchill was appointed as the Prime Minister. He took a solemn oath to fight to the last inch of English land. But the Americans still believed that the European war was not theirs. Roosevelt understood that he had no chance to win the third election if he called for participation in this war. So, overcoming himself, he started giving promises that he knew he would not be able to fulfill.
I have said this before.
As I have said before, but I could say it again, and again and again, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars.
In November 1940, Roosevelt won again and became the first and last president in American history who was elected 3 times. The situation overseas was getting worse and worse. France, the last bulwark of democracy on the continent, fell in summer. England was ablaze from constant Luftwaffe bombing, and Roosevelt was trying to get across to the people all importance of what was going on in Europe. After he won, he became more sincere and honest.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the high seas. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in America would be living at the point of a gun.
In March 1941, Roosevelt finally broke down the resistance of the Congress and convinced the country that they needed to help the countries in fighting with Hitler, primarily Great Britain. The Lend-Lease was the largest loan in human history. By the end of the war, the total cost of Lend-Lease supplies reached $5 billion. In fact, when Roosevelt launched the supplies, he led America into the war without sending any soldiers to the front line. At the same time, the rate of military production in the United States increased considerably. Roosevelt killed 2 birds with 1 stone. On June 22, 1941, Hitler Germany attacked the Soviet Union. In spite of rampant anti-communism in the government and Senate, Roosevelt was resolute that the Lend-Lease will also go to Russia. But why did Roosevelt decide to help the Soviet dictator?
Roosevelt did not believe that Stalin wanted to conquer the world, but Hitler's intentions were absolutely clear. Roosevelt also believed that the USA and the USSR would become closer to each other in this war, and he was absolutely right.
By his decision to help the Soviet Union, Roosevelt caused the new wave of attacks from those who believed that he had always been too mild to the Russians.
Roosevelt was the president when diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were established. Before, America was the only country in the world that did not recognize the Soviet Union. It considered it a usurpative, totalitarian regime which America had nothing to do with. Roosevelt changed the situation, not because he liked the Soviet Union or Stalin, but because he was realistic about this world, where the role of the Soviet Union was growing.
On August 14, 1941, Roosevelt had a meeting with another colleague of his in the future anti-Hitler coalition. At this meeting, Churchill asked Roosevelt directly, "When will America really enter this war finally?" Roosevelt mysteriously responded, "We are waiting for an incident." What did he mean? Maybe not Europe, but Asia. Back in July 1941, the United States ceased their supplies of oil and other strategic materials to Japan. They knew perfectly well that the Navy and Army of the Empire were totally dependent on American fuel. 2 months later, all Japanese accounts were frozen in the U.S. banks, both private and governmental ones. At that time, embargo was imposed on the trade with Japan. Maybe Roosevelt was waiting for the reaction for the incident he mentioned. Anyway, the incident did happen. On December 7, 1941, Japanese air forces conducted a surprise massive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States lost 188 airplanes, 12 ships, and 2,500 men. The next day, the Congress unanimously supported Roosevelt in declaring war on Japan.
Later, Roosevelt was accused that he supposedly knew that the Japanese had been preparing an attack against Pearl Harbor. He did not give any warning in order to use this fact as an excuse for the United States to enter World War II. But these were all speculations. But it's known for sure that it was Japan's attack against the United States military forces that helped Roosevelt in political terms to solve the problem of the full-scale U.S. participation in World War II.
Америку втянуть в войну было крайне и крайне сложно.
It was extremely hard to get America involved in the war. The United States did not want to fight for someone else's interests, like for Chinese interests. America was ready to kill only for itself. Before the Pearl Harbor incident, nobody could ever conceive the United States' direct participation in the warfare. America had to receive really a big strike. It's sort of like September 11th, 2001, when the planes hit the New York World Trade Center and America felt to be at war, and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq became possible. Pearl Harbor was the point when America turned toward its global role, which it has never given up since.
Pearl Harbor made possible only the war with Japan, but not with its ally Nazi Germany, that Roosevelt considered the main enemy of the United States and the whole of mankind. The dilemma that he faced was unexpectedly resolved by Hitler.
Nobody forced Hitler to declare war against the United States. But on December 11, 1941, giving his speech in the Sports Palace, Hitler declared war on the U.S., and he resolved the problem. Anti-Hitler coalition was established immediately: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. After Pearl Harbor, the United States warred in the Pacific. It was really a very powerful war. We know very little about it. For the West, an unknown war is what's going on the German-Soviet front line. For Russians, it's like the war in the Pacific.
Soldiers, tell it to the sailors, and tell it to the Marines. 3 little sisters, 2 little sisters of mine, and each one was only in a teen. One loved the soldier, one loved the sailor boy, and I loved the lad from the Marine. washed away. The girls said they'd be true until the boys marched back someday. Now the three little sisters, those three little sisters stay home, and read the magazine. You can tell it to the soldiers, tell it to the sailors, oh, tell it to the Marines.
But Germany should be defeated not in the Pacific, not in Asia, but by opening a second front in Europe, and the USSR insisted upon it. But the British Prime Minister restrained Roosevelt. Churchill would invariably say that landing in France would be too dangerous and might cause unacceptable human losses. Americans tried to explain to their Russian allies that the American army did not have experience of major battles and landing operations. They needed time for preparation. Roosevelt admitted that as long as the second front was not open, it would be the Soviet Union that would bear the major burden of the war. But as the President of the United States, his primary purpose was to defend American interests in this war. He needed victory, just like Stalin did, but not at any cost, with minimal losses. He had to think about the lives of American soldiers. And it was Stalin's duty to take care of the Russian soldiers.
Вообще российская традиция не жалеть солдата.
Well, the Russian tradition is not to spare soldiers. We had no war where the real central goal was to save the manpower. We would always overcome the weight, and World War II was not an exception. But sparing the lives of the soldiers is an American mentality. It has never been so weighty in the Soviet mind.
Оно более всегда присутствовало, чем в советской ментальности.
But Marshall said after the war that one of the most...
The General Marshall made a correct observation that the key feature of the war in a democratic country is to have one successful operation per year, so that the people would see that the war is successful. In September 1942, Roosevelt started to think about a military operation in Europe. But Churchill told him that England would no way participate in such an operation and suggested to attack North Africa instead. Despite the fact that the American General Staff was absolutely against this idea, Roosevelt agreed with Churchill's proposal. Why? It's all very simple. Though America had no benefit from the operations in Africa, it was politically beneficial for Roosevelt. First of all, it was one of those successful operations that public opinion wanted. Secondly, now when the Russians would ask America where the Second Front was promised by the Western Allies in France in 1942 was, and this one would most certainly not be opened, they could respond, "Sorry, we're busy fighting Germans here in Africa. How can you say we're doing nothing?"
В Африке. Как это вы говорите, что мы ничего не делаем?
We're doing something.
The African operation was successful. Now it was Roosevelt's turn to push against Churchill. It was high time to fulfill the promise he gave to the Russians. But Churchill still was against landing across the Channel. Instead, he suggested to land in Italy and to come to the German border this way. Moreover, Churchill believed that this blow would prevent the Red Army to move farther west. But Roosevelt cared much less about Sovietization of the post-war Europe than his British ally did. He was considering the necessity to meet with Stalin. He understood that in the post-war world, Russia will be a power equal to the United States. He viewed Stalin as the leader of the main power in Europe at that moment, and it would remain so after the war. And his other ally did not have such power. The British Empire was declining. Churchill felt more and more offended by his American partner and sensed that he was being upstaged. Roosevelt even tried to arrange for a meeting with Stalin secretly from Churchill. It did not work out, though. In November 1943, the first meeting of the Big Three was held in Tehran, Iran capital. As it was planned, Roosevelt tried to do everything to find a common ground with Stalin, even if he had to humiliate his British ally. In Tehran, Roosevelt and Stalin finally, in joint efforts, managed to move Churchill off his positions and came to terms about English and American troops landing in France. The date was set, June 1944. 18 hard months were still left to pass till the end of the war. Generals still racked their brains over maps. Soldiers still were being killed. Nazi camp prisoners were still dying in gas chambers. Millions of people around the world suffered incredibly, but it was not America where it all was happening. Americans did not suffer from the horrors of constant bombings or bloody battles from their hometowns or atrocities of occupation. The peaceful American landscapes were not darkened by fire and smoke, by crowds of people running in panic, and by endless columns of captives doomed to tortures in the death camps. America was lucky to avoid that. Many thousands of miles separated the United States and Wehrmacht advanced forces.
That civilization is the thing for me to see.
Bugler, sound assembly.
Get the move on, go on, Johnny, get your gun again. Make it one for all and all for one again. Uncle Sam still rates you his pal, and Miss Liberty is still your Sunday gal. Hurry, hurry, Johnny, get your gun again. Mr. Whiskers needs each mother's son again. Johnny, get your sleeves rolled up again. We've got a war to be won. Johnny, get your gun again. Uncle Sam still rates you his pal, and Miss Liberty is still your Sunday gal. You're drawn up again. We've got a...
By June 1944, the preparation for the long-awaited Operation Overlord, Allied troops movement across the Channel, was completed. On June 6th, American, British, and Canadian troops set out for the French coast. The scale of this operation was colossal: 7,000 ships, 12,000 planes, and over 500,000 soldiers. The Second Front in Europe was opened. By this time, Roosevelt's health started to worsen rapidly. Everything left marks: his disability, endless stresses over the 12 years of his presidency, the strain of the war and chronic smoking. His blood pressure was constantly over the top and he suffered from heart attacks. In several months, the always young-looking president became really old. His doctors would always remind him that if he wanted to survive, he had to work no more than 4 hours a day. But he put up himself as a candidate for presidency for the 4th time instead. He explained his decision this way: "Just as soldiers don't leave the battlefield, I cannot leave my office." Roosevelt said about the other candidates that they could make good presidents, but only he could see the full and immense opportunities that would open for America shortly. Thinking about the post-war future, Roosevelt wrote in his address to the Congress in 1944,
"A victory in war against the enemy is not enough for genuine and stable peace. And an equally basis essential to peace is a decent standard of living for all individual men and women and children in all nations. Freedom from fear is eternally linked with freedom from want. And military security is linked with economic security. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made."
In November 1944, Roosevelt won the presidential election for the 4th time in a row. By the beginning of 1945, the soldiers of the Allied armies were confidently moving towards German borders, both from the east and from the west. The Eastern European liberated from fascism was given to Stalin to take care of, which Churchill had been concerned about. It was time for the next meeting of the Big Three. Roosevelt came to Yalta to discuss really hard questions, the future of Europe and the post-war world constitution. At the conference in Yalta, Churchill paid every effort to defend Poland. Defense of Polish independence was the reason why England and France had declared war on Germany in 1939. But Roosevelt, to Churchill's disappointment, was not really supportive of him in these arguments, and did not hide his opinion. The Soviet Union has no less, and probably even more right to have its area of influence in Europe than the United States and Great Britain. It's an inevitable pay for the contribution the Soviet Union made in the defeat of Germany.
Danger of anything. He was a very savvy politician.
He was a very far-seeing politician, and he was not naive about the Soviet Union as some historians think. Roosevelt looked soberly at things and perfectly understood to have business relations between two countries, you need to have common interests, and at times even make concessions. It is remarkable, but in the USSR, they were of the same opinion. Russians did not want to have wars or confrontations with the United States. They also wanted to continue to have normal labor relations.
In his articles, speeches, conversations with his advisors, you can see his model of the post-war world. The USA, the USSR, China, Great Britain, the 4 states governing their spheres of influence, plus the UN created by his initiative. He was planning to leave the Pacific region for the United States, counting on the pro-American Chiang Kai-shek's China as his future ally. This plan could not entail any conflict with Stalin because of Poland or even Europe. Roosevelt once said, "Stalin is a realist, just like me." But he confessed about his doubts to one of his advisors. Will Stalin be able to fulfill what he agreed for at the crucial moment? After the conference was over on February 11, 1945, Roosevelt left for the United States.
Some people have argued that
Some historians believe that due to full physical exhaustion and rapidly worsening health, Roosevelt supposedly could not conduct the Yalta negotiations adequately, and that he even let Stalin convince him to agree to the hard Soviet terms about Eastern Europe, especially Poland. I absolutely disagree with that. I believe Roosevelt achieved in Yalta everything that could be achieved, taking into account the situation in the world at the moment. But anyway, the travel and negotiations took all of his energy.
Roosevelt was fading away. He had terrible headaches, and his heart would fail more often. His doctors prescribed him a strictest diet. They forbade him to drink his favorite cocktails and limited his smoking down to 10 cigarettes a day. Churchill often reminded of himself. He kept sending panic letters about Soviet threat to Europe and the whole world. He proposed to start a new war, now against the USSR. But Roosevelt was sure that for the next 20 years the Soviet Union would be assured of peace and would not care about new conquests. We need to have normal labor relations with the USSR and thereby lay the foundation of the new world order. The spring of 1945 was beautiful. On March 30th, Roosevelt, who felt absolutely jaded and exhausted, came to his estate in the state of Georgia. He hoped to have some rest and revive, but he was not able to relax. The World Conference was scheduled for April 25th. There, his long-awaited project was supposed to come to life, the United Nations organization. It had to become a prototype of the future world government. According to Roosevelt's plan, the leading role would belong to the Big Four: the USA, the USSR, Great Britain, and China. He said no stable peace is imposed on Earth without close cooperation among these states. These days, Roosevelt would think of the prayer from his young years.
O Lord, bless the earth with our honest, hard-working, sound knowledge, and pure morals. Preserve us, O Lord, from violence, discords, confusion, pride, and arrogance. Protect our freedoms, O Lord, and make us one nation. It is better when the government that lives in the spirit of mercy makes occasional mistakes than continuous indifference.
On April 9th, the weather got worse, but Roosevelt felt better. His old friend Lucy Mercer and the artist of Russian origin Elizabeth Shumatov came to visit. On April 12, 1945, the president, being, as always, impeccably dressed, was sitting at his desk in the living room and working on his speech. Shumatov tried not to distract him from work while painting his portrait. All of a sudden, in the total quietness of the study, broken only by the clock ticking, a pen dropped on the floor. President muttered very quietly, "What a pain! God, it hurts so much." Several hours later, Roosevelt died from cerebral hemorrhage. Roosevelt died less than a month before the victory. He was 63. On May 8, 1945, the United States celebrated the victory over Nazi Germany. Two weeks later, the first UN Assembly was opened. This organization was hoped to terminate the bloody anarchy of the two world wars, which took away almost 80 million lives. The delegations from all the countries that attended the assembly held a moment of silence to commemorate the U.S. President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In a recent survey about the world historians and politicians, Roosevelt was called the greatest leader of the USA in the 20th century. He was the only one to work in the office of the president for more than 3 terms. A disabled person in a wheelchair, he managed to lead America through the hardest decades of its history in the 20th century, through the Greatest Depression and World War II. Long ago, he said, "You have to share," and he launched social, political, and economic reforms in the USA, the fruits of which are still used by Americans. It was in Roosevelt's time that America turned into a superpower, which it remains. Even though the U.S. role in today's and tomorrow's world looks different from Franklin Roosevelt's plans, someone said, only a combination of a pragmatist and a romantic can make a great politician. His opponents called him different names: opportunist, red, even fascist. He is still called names. Probably because pragmatic and romantic Roosevelt left a deep imprint in the world history, and it is distinct even today. Roosevelt used to say, "Many historians believe that Roosevelt was a born victor, and this spirit helped him in his life." One of his biographers talks about his primeval energy, an inner force that has filled him since he was a child. He could not suffer a defeat in everything he did. Shortly before Roosevelt's death, one of his assistants who had been working with him side by side for many years was impressed by his endurance and asked how he could endure such incredible burdens. Roosevelt replied that every night lying in his bed before going to sleep, he would think of his childhood. And would take walks in his mind along the snow-covered Hyde Park paths. And at the end of such a walk, he would inevitably slide down a hill on a sledge. And he would fall asleep with these visions. And when he would wake in the morning, he would feel young, happy, and exuberant. The portrait of the 32nd U.S. president is still unfinished, and probably will never be.